My daughter stood at the top of her father-in-law's staircase, looked down at me in the front hallway, and said the words I never thought I would hear from the child I raised alone for 23 years. "Mum, you're embarrassing us just by being here." The room was full of people in expensive clothes. My coat was from a sale rack at Winners. And then the front door opened, and a woman I had never seen before walked in carrying a leather briefcase, and everything in that house changed forever. People often tell me that the deepest grief comes from losing a spouse. I lost my husband Walter when our daughter Penny was 11 years old, a construction accident on a job site outside Edmonton. A beam that wasn't secured properly. An investigation that went nowhere. Grief from losing Walter was enormous, yes. But what happened 18 years later? What my daughter allowed to happen? That was a different kind of loss entirely. The kind that doesn't announce itself all at once. The kind that sneaks in slowly, one small moment at a time, until one evening you are standing in someone else's hallway, feeling like a stranger in your own family. My name is Joan. I am 67 years old, and I live in a small house in Lethbridge, Alberta, the same house Walter and I bought together the year before Penny was born. The kitchen still has the yellow tiles he picked out at a salvage shop because I like the color. I could never bring myself to replace them. Some things you keep, not because they're valuable, but because letting go of them feels like letting go of the person. After Walter died, I did what mothers do. I kept going. I worked as an office administrator at a dental clinic for 14 years. I took on bookkeeping evenings for a small plumbing company, owned by a man in our neighborhood who paid me in cash and never asked questions. I drove Penny to swimming lessons, to school plays, to sleepovers, to every appointment she ever had. I sat in waiting rooms with library books in my lap so I wouldn't spend money on magazines. I packed lunches until she was old enough to be embarrassed by them. And then I packed them anyway and put them in a paper bag without a cartoon on it so nobody would notice. There were years when the distance between my paycheck and the end of the month felt like a canyon. I crossed it every time, every single time. Penny grew up kind. That's the first thing I want you to know about her, because what came later sometimes makes people forget. She was genuinely, naturally kind. She helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. She wrote thank you notes without being asked. When she was 14, she organized a coat drive at her school and delivered every single jacket herself because she didn't want to wait for a pickup. I raised her to believe that character was the thing that mattered, that what you did when no one was watching was the truest version of yourself. She was 26 when she met her husband, Philip, at a conference in Calgary. He was charming, she said, smart, thoughtful. He brought her flowers on their second date, called when he said he would, and remembered small things she mentioned only once. When she introduced him to me over dinner at a restaurant downtown, I liked him immediately. He had a good handshake, the kind that doesn't try too hard, and he looked at Penny the way Walter used to look at me, with genuine attention. Like she was the most interesting person in the room. What I didn't know then was that Philip came with a father. His name was Gordon Ashby. I'll say that name fully, deliberately, because he spent years making me feel like I didn't deserve to use it. Gordon Ashby, 63 years old, owner of a commercial development company based in Calgary called Ashby Pacific Holdings. He had built it, according to everyone around him, entirely on his own initiative, his own vision, his own exceptional business instincts. He lived in a house in Mount Royal that had a wine cellar, a media room, and a housekeeper named Flora, who wore a uniform on formal occasions. He drove a vehicle that cost more than my annual salary. He donated to hospital foundations and had his photograph taken with politicians. He was the kind of man who has learned to perform generosity so well that people mistake the performance for the real thing. The first time I met Gordon Ashby, he shook my hand and looked past my shoulder before my name had fully left his mouth. His wife, Renata. I'll call her Renata because that was her name, and she is not the villain here. Smiled and touched my arm and said something warm that I've since forgotten. But Gordon's eyes had already moved on to someone more interesting. I remember thinking, this man has never once in his life had to wonder whether he was enough. Still, I told myself I was being unfair. First impressions are unreliable. People are nervous at meetings like this. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because Penny loved Philip. And Philip seemed to love her, and that was what mattered. The wedding was held the following June at a vineyard outside of Kelowna. I wore a dress I had altered myself because the alterations shop quoted me $200, and I was already stretched thin from the flight. It was a beautiful day. Penny cried when she saw Philip at the end of the aisle, and he caught her hand and held it for a long moment before she reached him, like he couldn't wait another second. I sat in the front row and wept, the way mothers do. And for a little while the world felt entirely right. Then Gordon stood up at the reception and gave a speech. It lasted 11 minutes. I know because I counted. He talked about Philip's ambition, his potential, his capacity for success. He talked about the future they were building together as a family, meaning, of course, as a business extension of Ashby Pacific. He mentioned Penny twice, both times in relation to what she brought to Philip's trajectory. He did not mention me. Not once. Not even as an acknowledgement that the bride also had a parent present. I smiled through the entire 11 minutes and told myself it was an oversight. It wasn't. Over the next 2 years, the shape of things became clearer. Philip had joined Ashby Pacific Holdings shortly after the wedding. Gordon presented this as a natural opportunity, a generous gift, a father investing in his son-in-law's future. What it actually was, as I came to understand slowly, was a leash. A long, expensive, comfortable leash. Every favor came with a condition. Every opportunity came with an expectation. Philip spent more and more time at Gordon's side. Golf weekends, client dinners, board presentations. The couple moved from their apartment in Calgary to a house that Gordon had purchased and put in his own name, which he told them was a gift, but which required them to consult him before making any changes. I found that out when Penny mentioned, casually, that they'd wanted to repaint the living room and had to check with Gordon first. I began to see my daughter differently at gatherings. Not immediately. Not all at once. But there was a change. The way she deferred to Gordon. During conversations. About things she knew perfectly well. The way she laughed a little too quickly at his observations. The way she stopped offering her own opinions at the dinner table. And waited to see which direction the wind was blowing first. I recognized it because I had seen it before, in younger women who had learned that smaller was safer. I had spent my whole life refusing to become that. And I watched my daughter becoming it right in front of me. I tried once gently to say something. We were in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, just the two of us, and I said, "You seem quieter lately. Are you all right?" And she said, "Mum, I'm fine. This is just how things work in this family." She said it in a tone I'd never heard from her before. Not unkind, but final, like a door closing. That was the first time I felt the distance. The Ashby family held gatherings the way other people hold military exercises. Everything was organized, curated, purposeful. Guest lists were deliberate. Conversation topics were steered. The optics of every event were managed carefully, so that Gordon Ashby always emerged, looking like the most accomplished, most generous, most indispensable person in the room. I was invited to some of these events, I believe, because excluding the bride's mother entirely would have looked strange. Not because anyone particularly wanted me there. I noticed things. The way my place setting at the dinner table was always at the periphery. The way Gordon's eyes glazed when I spoke, and sharpened when Philip did. The way Renata would sometimes start to include me in a conversation, and then catch herself. As if she remembered something, and redirect. At one gathering, a man Gordon's age asked me what I did, and when I told him I had worked in administration and bookkeeping, he made a small sound in his throat that wasn't quite polite, and moved on to the person beside me. I was 64 years old, and I felt like I was 17 and sitting at the wrong lunch table. The evening things broke open. The evening I understood clearly that something was very wrong beneath the surface. Came at a dinner at the Ashby house. Gordon had invited several business associates, and the conversation turned, as it always did eventually, to legacy and succession. Gordon said, loud enough for the full table to hear, "The challenge with building something real is protecting it from people who don't understand what it cost." He was looking at no one in particular. He was looking at me. I excused myself from the table. I went looking for the bathroom and took a wrong turn down a hallway I hadn't been in before. A door was partially open. Light and voices spilled into the corridor. I heard Gordon's voice first. "She's going to be a complication." Then Phillips, she's Pesney's mother. That's just how it is. Gordon, without missing a beat. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm saying she doesn't understand what we're building here, and people who don't understand can cause problems without even meaning to. You need to decide where your priorities are. Silence. Then Philip, quieter. What exactly are you asking me to do? Gordon, I'm asking you to be clear about where you stand. Between the life I'm offering you and the obligations that belong to a different chapter. I stood in that hallway and I did not move. I waited. Philip said, Penny will follow my lead. Gordon said, good. I walked back to the table. I sat down. I finished my water. I smiled at the woman across from me who asked if I had found the bathroom all right. And I said yes, thank you, and I ate the rest of my dinner and said nothing. But in the car on the way home, I sat for 20 minutes in my own driveway before I went inside. I had a contact I hadn't called in many years. Her name was Sandra Kowalczyk. She had been Walter's corporate lawyer during the early years of his career, back when he was consulting on construction projects, and had started to build something of his own. Walter had been ambitious, quietly so, the way some people are ambitious without needing anyone to know. He had never been wealthy, but he had been careful. And Sandra, I remembered, had helped him be careful in specific ways. I called her on a Tuesday morning. When she answered, I said, Sandra, I think there's something I should have looked at years ago. She said, I was wondering when you'd call. I don't know what I expected to find. I think I expected something small. A loose thread, a minor oversight. What I found was nothing of the kind. Walter had been involved, years before his death, in a joint venture with 2 other men on a commercial property project outside Calgary. One of those men was a younger Gordon Ashby. I did not know this. Walter had never told me. Not because he was hiding it, Sandra said, but because the project had fallen apart after Walter died, and she had assumed that Gordon had told me. She had assumed Gordon had been in touch. She had assumed I knew. I had never heard Gordon Ashby's name before my daughter brought Philip home for dinner. Sandra pulled the original partnership documents from storage. It took her 3 weeks. When she laid them on the desk in her office in downtown Lethbridge, I sat across from her and read them slowly. The original venture had been structured clearly. Walter held a 38% ownership interest. Gordon held 31%. A third partner, a man named Frederick Kane, who had since moved to Vancouver, held the remainder. After Walter died, the project had been restructured. The restructuring had taken place 11 months after the accident. The revised documents showed Walter's interest had been absorbed into the remaining partnership under a clause that Sandra described as, and I am quoting her here, not something she would have recommended, and not something she had been consulted on. Someone had acted while I was a widow with an 11-year-old daughter, and no one advising me. Someone had made decisions about paperwork I didn't know existed, and for 23 years, Gordon Ashby had gone on building an empire that owed a portion of its foundation to a man he had pretended not to have known. I sat in Sandra's office for a long time after she finished explaining. I thought about the years of working the dinner shift. I thought about the coat from the sale rack. I thought about Penny's school fees and the used car that needed 3 repairs in one winter, and the vacation we never took because I couldn't manage it. I thought about Gordon Ashby's wine cellar and his media room and the house he put in his name and gave to my daughter and son-in-law as a favor. Then I thought about Penny saying, "This is just how things work in this family." I asked Sandra one question. What can actually be done? She said, quite a lot, as it turns out. The weeks that followed were quiet on the surface. I told no one what I had found. Not Penny, not Philip, not even my closest friend in Lethbridge, a woman named Gloria who has known me since before Walter died, and who would have been outraged on my behalf. I wasn't ready for outrage. I needed to think. Sandra brought in a second lawyer, a colleague of hers named David Park, who specialized in corporate disputes. He was methodical and careful, and he spoke in complete sentences without unnecessary flourish, which I appreciated. Together they assembled a picture of what had happened in the 11 months after Walter's death. It was not a pretty picture. There were letters from Gordon to the third partner, Frederick Kane, proposing the restructuring. There was correspondence that strongly implied Frederick had been resistant at first, and had then been persuaded. And there was the final amended document, signed without my knowledge, that had quietly erased my late husband's interest from the record. David Park said to me one afternoon, "This is not a small thing, Joan." I told him I understood. He said, "There are people who would want this to stay quiet." I said, "I know." Gordon Ashby had built his reputation over 23 years on a foundation that partially belonged to someone else. He had built his entire identity: the generous father-in-law, the self-made developer, the community contributor, on a story that was not entirely true. And he had done it while my daughter grew up without enough, while I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, while I thanked God every year for the salvage shop kitchen tiles, because they were the last thing Walter had chosen, and they were still standing. Penny called me during this time, twice, normal calls. She mentioned a trip they were taking with Gordon and Renata. She mentioned Philip's new title at Ashby Pacific. She asked whether I needed anything. I said I was fine. I asked about her. We talked for 20 minutes. The calls felt ordinary. I hated pretending they were. Then Gordon announced the event. He was hosting what he called a legacy dinner, a celebration of Ashby Pacific Holdings reaching its 30th year in operation. The guest list was extensive: board members, long-term business partners, city councilors, a provincial cabinet minister, local press. It was, in effect, a coronation. Gordon intended to formally announce Philip as his designated successor, the next generation of leadership, the proof that the Ashby name and the Ashby enterprise would continue. The invitations were elegant. The venue was the ballroom of a downtown Calgary hotel, and I received one, which surprised me until I realized it probably looked better to have the bride's mother present for a photograph. I called Sandra the morning I received the invitation. She said, "How do you feel about attending?" I said, "I think we should." David Park met with us 2 days before the event. All the documents were organized. Copies had been made and held in a second location. Frederick Kane, the third partner now living in Vancouver, had agreed to provide a written statement. He had been waiting, Sandra told me, for someone to ask. He said he had signed what he signed under pressure and had not felt right about it for 23 years. His hands had been shaking when he gave his statement, she said, though she hadn't asked me to imagine that. I imagined it anyway. The night of the legacy dinner, I wore the same dress I had worn to Penny and Philip's wedding. I had it pressed. I drove myself to Calgary. I checked into a hotel and I sat on the edge of the bed for a while before I left for the venue. I was thinking about Walter. The ballroom was everything Gordon had intended it to be: crystal and candlelight, round tables covered in white linen, a stage with a podium and a backdrop that read Ashby Pacific Holdings. 30 years of vision, hundreds of guests, servers in black moving through the crowd with champagne. Every inch of it was designed to say, "This man built something extraordinary. This man deserves to be celebrated." I found my table. I was seated near the back, naturally. Penny found me almost immediately. She looked beautiful in a green dress I hadn't seen before. She hugged me, briefly, and I could feel the tension in her shoulders. "Mum, I didn't know you were coming." I showed her the invitation. She looked confused for a moment, then resolved it somehow and smiled. "Well, I'm glad you're here." She didn't look entirely glad. She looked like someone who has just encountered an unexpected variable. Philip greeted me politely. He seemed distracted. Gordon moved through the room like a current, drawing people into brief orbit and releasing them. When he reached me, he extended his hand. "Joan, 1 syllable." That was all. Then he moved on. The speeches began. A board member spoke, a longtime business partner, a city official who said the words, "entrepreneurial vision," 4 times in 3 minutes. Then Gordon took the stage. He was an accomplished speaker, I will give him that. He had the timing of someone who has stood in front of rooms his whole life. He talked about the 30 years, about the projects, the risks, the growth. He talked about building something that would outlast any single person. Then he turned to Philip and said, with the warmth of a man who has practiced warmth until it comes naturally, "And the best investment I ever made was in the man standing right there." The applause was generous. Then a voice spoke from near the side entrance of the ballroom. "Mr. Ashby, before you continue, there's a matter that requires the attention of everyone in this room." Sandra Kowalczyk stood near the wall with David Park beside her. Both were dressed as if attending a professional function. Both were entirely calm. The room turned. Gordon's smile stayed on his face for exactly 2 seconds longer than it should have, which told me everything about the effort it took to keep it there. "Who are you?" Gordon said. His voice was controlled. Sandra introduced herself, then David Park. David said, calmly and clearly, that he represented the estate interests of Walter Marsh, my late husband, and that there were matters of documented ownership in the founding of Ashby Pacific Holdings that had never been properly resolved. He said this in the tone of a man reading a weather report, even, factual, undeniable. The room was silent. Gordon said, "This is not the time or the place." David said, "The documents don't have a preference about timing." He opened his briefcase. "But the people in this room may have an interest in understanding the full history of the company they've invested in." I watched Gordon from across the room. I watched the color shift in his face. I watched him look, just once, toward Philip. Philip was standing very still. He looked like a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not what he thought it was. David laid out the original partnership documents. He explained the founding structure. He explained Walter's 38%. He explained the timing of the restructuring. 11 months after a fatal workplace accident with no notification to the surviving spouse. He spoke calmly and at a moderate pace and did not raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The facts were doing all the necessary work. Gordon interrupted twice. David answered both interruptions with additional documentation. Then Sandra addressed the room directly. She said that the estate of Walter Marsh had an ongoing legal claim related to the restructuring of the original partnership, and that the documentation supporting this claim had been verified by 2 independent legal professionals. She said the claim was being filed the following morning. She said it not as a threat but as information, offered to people who deserved to know it before they continued celebrating a 30th anniversary. The room had gone completely still. I stood up from my table at the back of the room. I hadn't planned to, I simply found myself standing. Every head turned. I saw Penny across the room. Her face had pale. Her eyes were moving between me and her father-in-law, and back again, trying to understand what she was looking at. I understood what she was seeing for the first time. Her mother, standing in the middle of a room full of powerful people, and not flinching. I said, loud enough to be heard, "Walter Marsh helped build this. He didn't live to see it, but the record should reflect who was actually in the room." Gordon looked at me. For the first time in the years I had known him, he had no performance ready. No polished response. No strategic warmth. He was simply a man standing on a stage in a room full of people who were suddenly looking at him very differently. The evening ended without its intended conclusion. There was no formal succession announcement. Guests left in clusters, speaking quietly. Several board members approached David Park directly. 2 reporters who had been there for the human interest angle of Gordon's 30th anniversary exchanged numbers with Sandra. Renata sat very still at the head table, her hands folded in her lap, not looking at anyone. Philip walked out of the ballroom without speaking to me. I didn't follow him. Penny came to find me in the lobby as I was getting my coat. She stood in front of me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "I didn't know." I believed her. That was the hardest part. I believed her completely. I said, "I know, sweetheart." Her eyes filled. "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was that I hadn't been sure she would choose me, and I hadn't been ready to know that. But standing in that lobby, I chose a different truth. Because I needed to do it right, and doing it right took time. She stood there for another moment. Then she did something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. She hugged me the way she used to hug me, arms all the way around, like she meant it. I held on. What followed in the weeks and months after that evening was not simple or clean. Gordon Ashby did not simply surrender. He hired lawyers. He contested the original documentation. He issued a statement through a communications firm describing the legal action as a misunderstanding, rooted in grief and revisionist history. That statement ran in a Calgary business publication, and I read it at my kitchen table in Lethbridge and thought, that is a man who has never once considered that he might be wrong. But the documents were real. The timeline was real. Frederick Kane's statement was real. And David Park was thorough. Gordon's position weakened over a period of months. Several board members requested independent reviews. 2 long-term business partners declined to renew contracts until the matter was resolved. The provincial cabinet minister quietly distanced himself. The company Gordon had built on a partly borrowed foundation began, slowly, to show the cracks. Philip, during this period, was very quiet. He came to Lethbridge once, alone, on a Sunday. He sat at my kitchen table and we had coffee, and neither of us spoke for a long time at first. Then he said, "I want you to know I didn't know about the original partnership." I said, "I believe you." He stared into his mug. "My father isn't who I thought he was." I didn't respond to that right away. Then I said, "People are complicated, even the people we love." He looked up. He seemed younger than he had in years. What would Walter have done? In my position? The question surprised me. I thought about it seriously. He would have figured out what the right thing was, I said, and he would have done it quietly, without waiting for someone to applaud him. Philip nodded. He sat there for another few minutes. Then he thanked me and drove back to Calgary. I didn't know what he would do. But something about the way he asked that question made me hope. Penny and I began talking again. Really talking. The way we had when she was young, before Gordon Ashby entered our orbit. We talked on the phone for long stretches in the evenings. She told me things she'd kept to herself for years. The weight of the expectations at the Ashby house. The feeling that her own instincts were never quite right. The small moments of doubt she'd dismissed as weakness. I listened without saying I had seen it happening. That wasn't what she needed from me. She needed me to listen, and that I could do. She came to Lethbridge for a weekend in early autumn. We walked by the river. We ate at a diner we'd been going to since she was a child. We drove past her old school. I didn't try to make the weekend meaningful. It just was. Renata called me once, on an evening in October. I almost didn't answer. She said she owed me an apology. She said she had known, in a vague way, that something hadn't been right about the early years of Ashby Pacific. But she had never asked directly because she hadn't wanted to know the answer. She said that she regretted that. She said it quietly, without drama. I thanked her for calling. I meant it. The legal resolution came the following spring. It was not a public spectacle. It was paperwork and meetings and a settlement that David Park told me was fair, using a tone of voice that suggested it was more than fair. I signed the documents on a Tuesday afternoon in Sandra's office. Sandra poured 2 small glasses of whiskey from a bottle in her desk drawer. We drank them. I put the settlement toward 3 things. Part of it I kept, because I had lived carefully for 23 years and I was entitled to stop. Part of it I set aside in a trust for Penny, structured so that it was entirely hers, not dependent on anyone else's approval or management. And part of it I used to establish a bursary at a technical college in Edmonton, offered annually to a mature student returning to the workforce after a significant life disruption. It is named after Walter. That part was never a question. The day the bursary was officially registered, I went home and stood in my kitchen for a while looking at the yellow tiles. They are chipped now, in 2 corners. I have been meaning to fix them for years. Standing there that evening, I decided I won't. They are exactly as they should be. Penny came to the small ceremony the college held when the bursary was announced. Philip came too. He stood at the edge of the room and clapped with everyone else, and at one point I caught him looking at the framed photograph of Walter that I'd brought, and he nodded. Almost imperceptibly, the way people do when they're acknowledging something privately. Gordon Ashby sold a majority stake in Ashby Pacific Holdings 8 months after the legal settlement. The announcement was covered briefly in the Calgary business press. I read the article on my laptop at the kitchen table. Then I closed the laptop and made a cup of tea. It has been almost 2 years since the night I stood up in that ballroom. Sometimes Penny asks me if I feel differently now than I did before all of it happened. The honest answer is yes, but not in the way people expect. I don't feel triumphant. I never did. What I feel is something simpler and harder to describe. The particular relief of a person who spent 23 years not knowing they were carrying something heavy, and has finally been allowed to put it down. Walter would have hated the whole business, if I'm being truthful, not the outcome. He would have been glad the record was corrected. But the drama of it, the ballroom, the public moment. That wasn't his style. He was the kind of man who did things carefully and without announcement and trusted that the work would speak eventually. He was right about that, as it turned out. Even after 23 years, the work spoke. I think about him most mornings, not with grief anymore, mostly with something more like conversation. I'll stand at the window with my tea and think, look what happened. Look how it came out. And I imagine he'd say something measured and dry about how it could have been handled more efficiently, and I'd agree with him, and we'd both laugh. That's enough. For me, that's everything.